Max sat quietly in his small cage at the animal shelter. He was a little brown puppy with floppy ears and bright, curious eyes. Every day, he watched as people came and went, hoping someone would take him home. But so far, no one had. Max had never really known what it was like to have a home, and although the people at the shelter were kind, it wasn't the same as having a family. One rainy afternoon, Max noticed a boy standing at the entrance of the shelter. The boy looked around nervously, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. His name was Ben, and he had just moved to the small town with his family. Everything felt new and strange to him. New house, new school, new town. He was hoping a new dog might make things a little better. The shelter worker, a kind woman named Mrs. Green, greeted Ben with a smile. "Looking for a new friend?" she asked. Ben nodded. "Yeah, I've been thinking about getting a dog. I think it might help me settle in." Mrs. Green led Ben down the rows of cages, where different dogs barked, wagged their tails, or sat quietly, waiting for someone to notice them. Then they reached Max's cage. Max wasn't barking like some of the other dogs. He just sat there, his head tilted slightly, watching Ben with curious eyes. "That's Max," Mrs. Green said, unlocking the cage. "He's a sweet puppy, about 4 months old, a bit shy, but he's very smart." Ben crouched down and held out his hand. Max hesitated for a second, then took a few steps forward and sniffed Ben's hand. Something about the boy felt right. Max slowly wagged his tail, and Ben smiled. "I think he likes you," Mrs. Green said warmly. Ben's smile grew wider. "I like him too," he said, standing up. "Can I take him home?" "Of course," Mrs. Green replied. "Let's get the paperwork done." As Ben walked out of the shelter, carrying Max in his arms, the rain had started to let up. Max felt the warmth of Ben's arms around him, something he had never experienced before. It wasn't just the physical warmth. There was a feeling of comfort, safety, and a strange sense of belonging. When they got home, Ben carefully set Max down in the living room. The house was still full of unpacked boxes, but Max didn't mind. He padded around, sniffing everything with great curiosity. Ben watched him, feeling a sense of excitement bubble up inside him. This little puppy was his responsibility now, his companion in this new chapter of life. Max sniffed a soft blanket on the couch, then looked up at Ben with his big brown eyes. Ben sat down next to him, gently scratching behind Max's ears. Max felt a rush of warmth, something he had never felt before. It wasn't just about having a place to stay. It was about having someone to stay with. From that moment, Max knew that his life was about to change. This was his home now, and Ben wasn't just a boy. He was Max's boy. As they sat together, Max felt a special connection growing between them, something deep and unspoken. Max had found his place, and for the first time, he felt truly at home. As the days passed, Max and Ben quickly grew inseparable. Max, now more comfortable in his new home, followed Ben everywhere. Whether Ben was doing homework at the kitchen table or watching TV on the couch, Max was always right there by his side, his tail wagging happily. Every morning, after Ben finished breakfast, they would head out for a walk around the neighborhood. The first time Max saw the park, his tail wagged so fast it was a blur. The open space, the soft grass, and the fresh air made Max feel free. Ben loved the park just as much, especially because it gave him time to clear his head before school. Max would dash through the park, running circles around Ben, his tongue hanging out in pure joy. One afternoon, Ben brought Max to meet his 2 best friends, Tom and Emily. They had all planned to hang out at the park after school, and Ben wanted them to meet his new puppy. "Wow, Max is so full of energy." Emily laughed as Max ran up to her, sniffing her shoes and wagging his tail. Tom smiled and reached down to pat Max on the head. "He's awesome, Ben. He's going to be a great dog." Ben beamed with pride. "Yeah, he's the best." Max could feel the happiness in Ben's voice and jumped up to lick his hand. They played for hours that afternoon, tossing a frisbee for Max to chase and running through the park's open field. Ben loved seeing Max so happy, and he couldn't help but feel that Max had made his life so much better. Even his friends noticed how much brighter Ben seemed since he got Max. But while things were going well with Max, school was becoming harder for Ben. He had just started middle school, and the work was more difficult than before. Some of his classmates weren't as friendly as he'd hoped, and he felt a bit lonely at times. Max could sense this change. Whenever Ben came home from school, his footsteps were slower, and he didn't smile as much. Max would greet him at the door, wagging his tail like always, but Ben's hug was softer, less excited. Max knew something was wrong. He would curl up next to Ben while he did his homework, resting his head on Ben's lap, as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone." One evening, after a particularly tough day at school, Ben sat on his bed with his head in his hands. He had gotten a bad grade on a test, and his friends hadn't been very supportive. Max jumped up onto the bed beside him and nudged Ben's hand with his nose. Ben looked down at Max, his eyes a little sad. "Why can't school be as easy as spending time with you?" Ben whispered, scratching Max behind the ears. Max's tail wagged softly. He didn't understand school, but he understood Ben. He knew that when Ben felt down, it was his job to lift him up. Max licked Ben's hand, trying to cheer him up in the only way he knew how. That evening, as they sat together on the bed, Ben felt a little better. Having Max by his side made him feel less alone, and he realized that even when things were tough, he had Max to lean on. The love and loyalty Max showed every day reminded Ben that there was always someone who cared about him, no matter what happened at school. Over the next few weeks, Max became more than just a fun companion. He became Ben's support, his comfort. Every time Ben felt stressed or upset, Max was there to remind him that everything would be okay. Their time at the park became even more special. Ben would talk to Max about his day while they ran together, and somehow, just talking made things feel a little better. Max might not have understood every word Ben said, but he knew his purpose. He wasn't just there to play. He was there to be Ben's friend in every way possible, and in return, Ben gave Max something he had always longed for, a place to belong. Together, they were more than just a boy and his dog. They were a team, growing closer every day. Life at home was usually peaceful, but one morning, things changed. Ben woke up to the sound of soft coughing coming from his mom's room. He knocked on the door gently, pushing it open to see her lying in bed, looking pale and tired. "Mom, are you okay?" Ben asked, his voice full of concern. "I'm just feeling a little under the weather," she replied weakly. "I think I caught something. I'll be fine. Don't worry." But Ben did worry. His mom, who always seemed so strong, looked fragile today. As the days passed, her illness didn't improve. She became weaker, and soon Ben had to take on more responsibility at home. He helped cook dinner, cleaned up around the house, and even took care of his mom by bringing her water and checking her temperature. It was a lot for a young boy to handle. Max noticed the shift right away. He could sense that something wasn't right. Ben's usual cheerful mood had faded, and he seemed more quiet. His face often creased with worry. Max didn't understand what was happening, but he knew Ben needed him now more than ever. Each day, when Ben came home from school, his first stop was always his mom's room. Max would follow closely behind, sitting by the door as Ben checked on her. Afterward, Ben would slump down on the couch, tired and overwhelmed. Max would climb up beside him, laying his head gently on Ben's lap, his warm brown eyes watching him carefully. One evening, after a particularly long day, Ben sat quietly at the dinner table, staring at his untouched food. His mom had been too sick to cook, so he had tried to make something himself, but his mind was elsewhere. Max, sensing the tension, lay at his feet, pressing his nose softly against Ben's leg. "Hey, buddy," Ben whispered, reaching down to stroke Max's soft fur. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Max's tail wagged slightly. He didn't need to understand the words to feel the weight of Ben's emotions. He could sense the sadness and anxiety in the air. Every time Ben seemed lost in thought, Max would nudge him gently, reminding him that he wasn't alone. As the days passed, Ben's exhaustion began to show. Between school, taking care of his mom, and managing the house, he barely had time to rest. Max noticed that Ben's smile, once so easy and bright, had become rare. His footsteps were heavier, and he often sat in silence, staring at nothing in particular. But Max refused to let Ben drift too far into his worries. Whenever Ben looked too down, Max would bring over his favorite toy, a squeaky ball that never failed to get Ben's attention. He'd drop it at Ben's feet and look up with big, hopeful eyes as if to say, "Let's play, just for a little while." At first, Ben would sigh, too tired to even think about playing, but Max wouldn't give up. He would nudge the ball closer and wag his tail, determined to lift Ben's spirits. Slowly, Ben would reach down, pick up the ball, and toss it across the room. Max would dart after it, his paws skidding across the floor as he chased it down. And for just a moment, Ben's face would light up again. Max didn't need words to know that his presence was making a difference. He stayed close to Ben every day, always there when Ben needed a quiet moment of comfort. Whether it was curling up next to him on the couch, lying at the foot of his bed at night, or simply sitting beside him while he did his homework, Max was always there, a constant source of warmth and love. As the weeks went by, Ben's mom slowly began to recover. She could sit up in bed more often, and her strength started to return. Ben still felt the weight of responsibility, but with Max by his side, it felt a little lighter. One evening, after Ben had tucked his mom into bed, he sat down on the porch with Max, the evening air cool and fresh. The stars twinkled overhead, and the quiet of the night wrapped around them like a blanket. "You know, Max," Ben said softly, looking down at his loyal friend, "you've been my rock through all of this. I don't think I could have made it without you." Max wagged his tail slowly, his eyes filled with understanding. He hadn't done anything special, at least not in his mind. He had just been there, ready to offer comfort, to play when Ben needed a distraction, and to sit quietly when words weren't enough. And for Ben, that had been everything. One bright Saturday afternoon, Ben and Max were at the park, as usual. Max was chasing a frisbee across the field, his ears flapping in the wind, while Ben watched with a smile. His friend Emily sat next to him, her feet tucked under the bench. "You know, Ben," Emily began thoughtfully, "Max is really smart. Have you ever thought about taking him to a competition training class? I bet he'd do great." Ben looked at her, surprised. "A competition? I don't know, Em. Max is just Max. He's playful, but he's never been trained for anything serious." Emily smiled. "That's exactly why you should try. It's not just about winning. It's about giving Max a chance to show what he can do. And honestly, it might be good for you too. You've been through a lot lately. This could be a fun way to focus on something positive." Ben sat back and thought about it. He had never considered entering Max into any kind of competition before. Max was his best friend, his loyal companion, but the idea of training for a competition made him nervous. What if Max didn't do well? What if it was too much pressure for both of them? On the other hand, Max loved learning new things. He had always been quick to understand commands, and his energy seemed limitless. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe this could be something good for both of them. After a few minutes of silence, Ben nodded slowly. Okay, let's give it a try. The following week, Ben signed Max up for a local training class. It wasn't just any class. It was designed to prepare dogs for agility competitions. Ben wasn't sure what to expect, but as soon as they walked into the training center, Max's tail began to wag furiously. There were jumps, tunnels, and ramps set up all over the place. Max's eyes lit up with excitement. "All right, Max," Ben whispered, bending down to scratch his ears. "Let's see what you've got." The trainer, a tall woman named Carla, greeted them warmly. "This is Max," she asked, kneeling down to let Max sniff her hand. "He looks like a natural." Ben laughed nervously. "I hope so." They started with basic commands: sit, stay, come. Max, as expected, followed each one perfectly, his eyes focused on Ben the whole time. But when it came time to try the more challenging tasks, like running through tunnels or jumping over hurdles, Ben felt a knot of worry in his stomach. What if Max didn't understand? What if he failed? But to Ben's surprise, Max took to the challenges with ease. He hesitated at first, unsure about running through the dark tunnel, but with a little encouragement from Ben, he bolted through and came out the other side, his tail wagging like crazy. Ben's heart swelled with pride. Each day they trained, Max got better and better. He learned how to weave through poles, jump over bars, and even balance on narrow beams. Ben found himself looking forward to the training sessions just as much as Max did. It was something new for both of them, and it gave Ben a sense of purpose outside of school and home. A few weeks later, it was time for the local competition. Ben felt nervous as they arrived at the park, where a course had been set up for the dogs. Max seemed to sense Ben's nerves and pressed his head against Ben's leg for comfort. "You're going to do great," Ben whispered, stroking Max's fur. "No matter what happens, you're already the best dog here." Emily showed up to support them, holding a sign that read, "Go Max," in bright colors. "You guys are going to crush it," she said with a grin. As they waited for their turn, Ben watched the other dogs go through the course. Some were fast and graceful. Others stumbled or hesitated. When it was finally their turn, Ben took a deep breath and walked Max to the starting line. "Ready, Max?" Ben asked, his voice steady, but his heart racing. Max looked up at him with bright eyes, his tail wagging. The whistle blew, and Max took off. He darted through the first tunnel, leapt over the hurdles, and weaved between the poles like a seasoned pro. Ben ran alongside him, shouting encouragement, his heart pounding with excitement. As Max approached the final jump, Ben held his breath. Max gathered himself, pushed off the ground, and soared over the bar, landing perfectly on the other side. The crowd cheered, and Ben's face lit up with joy. They had done it. At the end of the competition, Max won third place. It wasn't first, but to Ben, it didn't matter. Max had shown courage, intelligence, and heart. As they stood on the podium, with Max wagging his tail proudly, Ben realized that the competition wasn't about winning. It was about discovering what they could achieve together. Holding Max's ribbon in his hand, Ben looked down at his loyal friend. "You were amazing, Max. I'm so proud of you." Max, as if understanding, licked Ben's hand and wagged his tail even harder. In that moment, Ben felt a renewed sense of confidence, not just in Max, but in himself. They had faced the challenge together, and they had come out stronger. And as they left the park that day, with Emily chatting excitedly beside them, Ben knew that whatever challenges came next, he and Max would be ready. Years passed, and Ben grew taller, older, and busier. School turned into high school, and then there were college applications, new friendships, and part-time jobs. Life seemed to speed up for Ben, but no matter how fast things moved, Max was always there, his loyal companion through every change. Max had grown older, too. His once boundless energy had slowed a little. His steps were not as quick, and the streaks of gray in his fur were more noticeable now. But Max never let that stop him from being by Ben's side. Whether it was early mornings before school or quiet evenings after long days, Max was always there, resting at Ben's feet or following him around the house. As Ben entered college, he found himself coming home less often. But each time he walked through the door, Max greeted him with the same excited wagging tail and joyful bark. It didn't matter if Ben had been gone for a week or just a few hours. Max's happiness at seeing him never changed. One summer evening, after a particularly long day of studying, Ben came home and collapsed onto the porch steps. The sky was a brilliant mix of pink and orange as the sun set, casting a warm glow over the yard. Max trotted over and sat down beside him, leaning his head against Ben's leg. Ben sighed deeply, running his hand through Max's fur. "It's been a tough day, buddy," he said softly. "Everything's changing so fast. I'm not even sure what I'm doing half the time." Max tilted his head, listening to the sound of Ben's voice. He might not have understood the words, but he understood the emotion behind them. Without hesitation, Max nudged his head closer, offering silent comfort the way he always had. "You've always been here for me," Ben continued, looking down at Max with a fond smile. "No matter what happens, you're always here." Max's tail thumped softly against the ground. He had been through every stage of Ben's life, through the happy moments and the difficult ones, the quiet times and the chaotic ones. To Max, being by Ben's side was all that mattered. It was his purpose, his reason for being. As the years rolled on, Max watched as Ben became an adult. He moved out of the house for college, but he visited often, and Max was always waiting. The days of chasing frisbees in the park were fewer now, but Max didn't mind. He was content just to lie by Ben's feet as they sat in the yard, watching the world go by. One evening, as they sat under the stars, Ben leaned down and whispered, "You've always been my best friend, Max." Max, feeling the warmth of Ben's hand on his head, closed his eyes. In that moment, he knew everything he needed to know. His life, from the very beginning, had been full of purpose. He had been brought into this world to be with Ben, to love him, to comfort him, and to stand by him no matter what. Max's tail wagged slowly, contentedly. He understood now, more than ever, why he had been by Ben's side all these years. It wasn't about the games or the walks, or even the competition they had won together. It was about being there, being a constant presence of love and loyalty in Ben's life. As the night grew darker, Max rested his head on Ben's lap, his heart full of love and peace. He didn't need words to express what he felt. He had always known his mission, to be Ben's faithful companion through all the ups and downs, to make sure that Ben never felt alone. And as Ben sat quietly, stroking Max's fur, Max's inner thoughts felt clear. "I came into this world for one purpose, to be here for Ben, to give him love when he needed it, to offer comfort when the world felt heavy. And as long as I am here, I will always be his loyal friend, his forever companion." In that quiet moment under the stars, both Max and Ben knew that their bond was unbreakable, one built on years of friendship, trust, and unconditional love. Max had fulfilled his mission. He had been everything Ben needed, and that was all that mattered.